All right. So we've talked about this idea that strength is overcoming inertia. And really that's what muscle does, is it overcomes inertia. We need muscle to overcome inertia. So what I want you to watch in this is I want you to watch this, which is a final in a world championship. And you can see from this athlete right here that this is a Paralympic world championship, because you can see that this young lady has a graphite cheetah, which is the type of prosthetic, and she's a below knee amputee. And so this is going to be a series of amputees. And what you're going to see is exactly what muscle does. Because muscle overcomes inertia. You can see that they're all stopped right now. By the time they go from stopped to maximal speed, that's what muscle does. It gets you from that stopped to the maximal muscle speed. And so what I want you to do is I want you to keep an eye on the field, and I want you to see how it develops differently for the different athletes. And that's going to be important for understanding what muscle does. All right, so let's take a look at this. Here they go, and off they go. And I want you to keep an eye on this athlete right here. Because see how far behind she is? She's way behind everybody. But now look what happens. She goes flying past everybody. Okay, so now let's try and figure out why she does that. So I'm going to stop this right here. Whoops. I'm going to stop it. And hopefully it won't change the slide again. Right here. All of the athletes here, 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 and here that are way ahead of her, they're single leg amputees. You can see they have a biological leg with muscle on one of their legs, and then they have a prosthetic on the other. She has two prosthetics. She's the only one in the race with two prosthetics. Because she has two prosthetics, she doesn't have muscle below her knee on either leg. The result is that she doesn't have as much strength in her legs to overcome the inertia of the start. So up to 20 meters, she's going to be way behind because muscle overcomes inertia. It gets you going. Once you're up and you're going, the more muscle you have, the slower you are. So now as we watch this race progress, she's going to go from way behind these other women who are elite athletes in their own right. But now what she's going to do is she's just going to fly past everybody. And the reason that she flies past everybody is because what's happening here is she has two prosthetics. Those two prosthetics store and return energy at a very, very high rate. Our tendons, our able-bodied muscle attachment, our tendons, only store and return about 30% of the energy that they absorb. A graphite cheetah stores and returns about 60% of the energy that it goes into it. So once she gets up to speed, now her muscle isn't important. Now what becomes important is your storage and return of energy. The better you store and return energy, the faster you're going to go. So if you have two cheetahs, you're going to store and return energy about 60% of it. If you have one cheetah, you're going to store and return about 30% on one leg, 60% on the other. The average of those two things is going to give you that 45% energy return you're going to get total. So she has got 60% energy return. An athlete like this is going to have 45% energy return. So she gets much more energy back from each step. And as she goes further, she gets more and more of that energy because you get faster. Now your cheetahs are absorbing more energy, returning more energy. So muscles overcome the inertia of the start. Once you get up and going, you don't need the muscle anymore. And that's because muscle has three roles. Muscle performs as a motor. So if I'm going to do a bicep curl, my muscle is going to be a motor that's going to shorten the joint. It's going to perform a shortening contraction to overcome the inertia of a weight. My muscle can also perform the role of a brake. And that's when somebody throws me something and I catch it and I use my muscle to reduce the inertia of whatever's falling. The third role that your muscles perform, I'm going to do in a separate video, and that's this role of a strut. Actually, I think I can do it here. Best and the easiest way is to do it with the tricep. So if I'm completely relaxed and I put a pressure on my arm, and I completely relax, what I do is I bend at the elbow. If I now flex my tricep isometrically, you see what I did? I'll relax again. Completely relaxed. I'm pushing, my elbow moves. I do an isometric contraction of my tricep. Now, my shoulder moves. So what my muscle is doing through an isometric contraction is it's contracting to transmit the force and change the joint that moves. And our muscles work that way. Our calf muscle works that way when we run. Most importantly, our core muscle works that way. Our core muscles work that way. When we contract our core muscles, what that does is instead of moving at the spine, I'm going to move at a different place. So let's take our bicep curl example. And I don't know if this is going to be easily seen, but basically if I'm going to do a bicep curl, and if I keep my muscles, all of my muscles really loose, as soon as I go out here, what I would actually end up doing is I would actually end up pulling my upper body down. Because if I don't contract my core muscles as struts isometrically, as soon as I lift the weight out in front of me, the weight is going to actually pull my body forward. So the third important role that muscle plays is to work as a strut, to contract isometrically, to change the joint that moves. And that's really, really important. Or to really just transmit force. It works more like a tendon than it does like a muscle. Super important in performance. Because remember, when do we use energy? Which muscle contraction uses the most energy? Concentric muscle contractions. Because when do we use energy? We use energy when myosin has to cycle. So when myosin is grabbing and it releases from actin, it releases from actin when it gets ATP. It's going to break the ATP when it reaches again, and then it grabs and goes. ATP, ATP, ATP. So it's using energy every time it goes through that cycle. If I'm doing an isometric contraction and I'm just holding here, there's no cycling. So I'm going to use significantly less energy. You can see here that's measured as phosphocreatine. And if you use more phosphocreatine, you're using more energy. So during isometric or during concentric contractions, they're decreasing the amount of phosphocreatine. They're using ATP and they have to regenerate it using the creatine. Whereas if you look at the isometric, you're using less than a third of the amount of energy that you did for your concentric contraction. Your eccentric is in between because eccentric contractions, what's happening is you're holding, and then it's too much force so it slips, and now you have to use an ATP to re-grab so that you can hold on again. And so you're using a few ATP to re-grab to get rid of to be able to re-grasp to the actin. And so the eccentric contractions use a little bit more, but really these concentric contractions just use a whole lot more force. Or sorry, not force, but they use a whole lot more energy because they're much more about contracting and using the myosin heavy chain to go around its cycle. Whereas an isometric contraction, it's not cycling. You can do that when you're dead. So it doesn't cost any energy. So how do we use this when we run? This is a great study. T.J. Roberts is like my man crush of a scientist. He's a great scientist. He does all these super cool experiments. And in this experiment, what he did is he took turkeys and he put a little sensor in their muscle and in their tendon. In their muscle, it told them the length and the force in both your muscle, so how long the muscle was and how much force it was producing, and how long the tendon was and how much force it was producing. And then he ran them along a treadmill. And just like you and I, turkeys run on two legs, and so the turkey's running along. It doesn't use its arms like I'm doing here. But what it's doing is it's going to swing its foot forward, and it's going to swing its foot forward. It's going to hit the ground, and it hits the ground right here at this black line, this dotted line. And then it's going to load that foot, and then it's going to toe off. And so that's the length of the muscle here. And this is the calf muscle. So here we're going to talk about the muscle back here. So basically, as you're swinging through the air, the calf muscle is getting longer because the foot is coming up. That makes sense. And then right before it hits the ground, you actually shorten your calf muscle. So you're loading before you hit the ground. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second. Then you hit the ground, and now you go through this whole thing. And if you look at the length of the muscle actually doesn't change length. Well, maybe it's not producing any force. So let's go down to the bottom. Oh, look at the force. There's very little force during the swing phase, but now you hit the ground, bam, there's this huge force. Big force, no change in length. By definition, that's an isometric contraction. Here's the interesting part, and this is something you guys all know about. Before you hit the ground, this is your brain telling your muscle where to go. This is called an electromyograph. And so electromyograph is measuring the electrical activity going to the muscle. All right? Before you hit the ground, you turn that muscle on, you shorten the muscle, and you prepare the muscle for impact. Why do I say you know this already? Because we've all experienced this. We've all been walking with somebody that we think is really cute. We're trying to impress, and we're walking along. It's a little bit dark maybe, and we're all of our attention is focused on this incredible person beside us. And suddenly you don't see this little 1.5-inch little dip in the road. And you step into that 1.5-inch dip in the road, and suddenly you look like the biggest idiot on the earth because you collapse and you almost fall on the ground. Why? You look back and you think it's going to be this huge step, that you stepped into this massive hole. But it was only this big. Why was it so big? Why did you have this big effect? Because you tighten your muscle in preparation for impact. If you don't impact the ground when you think you're going to impact the ground, what do? You relax your muscle. Oh, I guess we missed. And as soon as you relax your muscle, now you're not storing all of the energy from that step so that you can get it back from your tendon. And now what you do is you didn't store the energy. Now you have to use your muscle as a motor instead of using your muscle as a strut. All right? So we use a muscle as a strut when we walk and when we run to keep that muscle contraction right before we hit the ground, to absorb the energy and to have that energy go into our tendon that stretches and recoils and gives us the energy back for free. So our muscle contracts isometrically. So at a low energy cost, we get the full effect. What happens when you run up a hill? Now look, you still are swinging your muscle. You're still swinging your foot forward, so you're still lengthening your muscle. You're still contracting before you hit the ground. You're using a lot more motor units to contract because it's harder to run uphill. And now look what happens. You hit the ground here, and now your muscle continues to get shorter while you're on the ground. So you're using your muscle as a motor. You're doing a concentric contraction. To get that same force to push you up the hill, you have to overcome the inertia of the hill. So now you do a concentric contraction. So now you're doing a contraction that costs more ATP. And so you start breathing heavier because your contraction, to run that speed, you have to contract the muscle harder to overcome the inertia of the hill, and you have to use your muscle as a motor. So now using your muscle as a motor costs more energy. You start breathing heavier. You are at a disadvantage when you're running up a hill. And I'm sure you look at this and you go, wow, this isn't a turkey. Does it apply to humans? Look at, this is a study that was done in elite Kenyan runners, where they had them jump and they looked to see how their muscle was. And this is Finnish students who were just students who they compared them to. And look at the Kenyan runners. The muscle length during these jumps doesn't change. They're still producing a lot of force. Muscle length doesn't change. Look at the Finnish students. They're doing the exact same movement, but look at, they have to use their muscle as a motor. So now if you were to put a race on between this elite Kenyan athlete and this Finnish student, it'd be like one is running up a hill and the other is running on the flat. It's really not fair. And that's because these students haven't adapted to be able to use their muscle isometrically to perform these movements. And so they're at a huge disadvantage, and their performance is going to be way, way below. It's as if they're running up a hill. But you can see that the turkey running up a hill is very similar to the student the Kenyan athlete is similar to a turkey running on the flat. So that's how we use our muscles when we run. We use them isometrically. We let the tendon stretch and recoil, stretch and recoil.